Not quite sure how I follow that. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and talk to you. The way I'd like to structure it tonight, if I may, is to do a quick introduction about Shell. I'll do a little introduction about me and sort of my career path within Shell. But the vast majority, I want to talk about something I feel really passionately about, the energy challenge, which, as you'll see as I sort of unfold this story, I think is one of the biggest challenges facing humankind in the coming decades. And we all have a very significant role to play, I think, in that challenge. The last time I did a speech like this, I had to do battle with a man dressed as a polar bear, so I'm slightly hoping that any protests this evening are somewhat less physical than and more verbal. But if there are questions, challenging or otherwise, we'll have about I hope about 20 minutes or so of Q&A time if you want to dig into any of the points that I've made this evening. I don't know if you can see this. Perhaps I'd start with saying these are a few sort of statistics sort of shown about the company I work for, about Shell. Perhaps the most surprising one to most is that we are about 2% of the world's oil production. So we are really, really small in terms of oil production. Having said that, you can see the numbers there, how much capital we spend, $40 to $50 billion a year of capital, projects spread across the surface of the earth, ranging from the US, Latin America, Africa, Asia, every continent we have something. So the reason I say the 2% is to give you a sense of the scale of the energy challenge, the scale of what we're embarking on in trying to address the challenge of the world's energy need. It is an enormous, a vast enterprise that needs huge numbers of people and needs the most creative minds on the planet, I think, to make it work in the future. Then I used my career to obscure my face in this photo. I hope you like it. I think most of it I mean, there's a sort of a journey here of chemical engineering here, and then I spent quite a bit of time in oil refining, plying my trade as a chemical engineer. I jumped from there into a sort of more commercial sales and marketing role, did an MBA, then had my first overseas assignment. I lived in Singapore for 3 years doing business development across the Asia-Pacific region, which was really, really fantastic experience, both from a work point of view, but also having only ever lived in Europe, sort of to live in the Asian environment was really, really special. Got my first sort of what I'd call general management role, looking after part of our lubricants business. Went to live in Houston, Texas for 4 years, running Shell's catalyst business. Then I got a role in looking after technology for all of our downstream activities. I do a little bit of stuff outside the workplace with the Institution of Chemical Engineers and Royal Academy of Engineering. And then finally spent some time as the country chairman here in the UK. And then just over a year ago, I moved to the Upstream organization, and I do business development, which means, by and large, talking and negotiating with governments to help them develop their oil and gas resources in their particular country. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Mozambique talking to the Prime Minister of Mozambique about a venture that we're trying to develop with the extensive gas resources they've got offshore in Mozambique. So that's a little bit about me, and we can come back to that if it's of any interest. The world energy challenge is very, very significant. The energy business is extremely large, and we are entering a time, as I describe on this slide, of volatility and transitions. What I say to every sort of, when I talk to students and talk to young people, what I say is the energy system, the energy company that I joined in 1988, if I look at it now, it's roughly the same. We roughly do the same things. We find oil and gas, we sort of find it, process it and deliver it into refineries, we refine it, and then, if you look at the world's energy needs, it's probably 98% based on hydrocarbons. The energy system 25 years from now, though, is going to be very, very different. And there's going to be a real challenge of how governments, how society, and how corporations make that transition from being a largely hydrocarbon-based economy in terms of energy through to something that is a bit more balanced in terms of the growth of renewable energies, the issues of climate change, etc. How will that transition happen in the coming decades is a real conundrum. And on this chart, I talk about fast-moving technologies. It's right about now that solar energy is reaching grid parity. So solar energy starts to become, without any subsidy, starts to become competitive with oil and gas. Right about now, you see political and social instability impacting the energy business. It's probably impacted it for many decades. But if you think about the Middle East and issues in Iraq and Syria, the knock-on effect into Saudi Arabia, the re-emergence of Iran, geopolitics and the energy system are intimately intertwined. And so I never quite understood why in Shell we had played such importance on our relationship with governments. The reality is every government on the planet has an energy policy. Every government on the planet wants to seek to understand how they will power their nations in the future. And therefore, our understanding of how governments work, what their thoughts are on an energy policy is a really important part of how we respond and how we develop our business in order to make money for our shareholders and answer this sort of energy challenge. Demographics, the stark reality is that in the coming decades, we will go from 7 to 9 billion people on the planet. There is a dramatic shift of urbanization happening right now. It's probably the largest movement of humans on the surface of the earth that's ever happened in these few decades of people moving from largely agrarian lives into cities and manufacturing. And what happens then? Well, actually they get quite energy intensive when they become urbanized. So they, in the developing nations, whether that's India or it's China or it's Indonesia or it's Vietnam or whatever, they want the same things as we do. They want lights, they want air conditioners, they want refrigerators, they want motorcycles and cars and mopeds, and frankly, who are we to say that they can't have them? But that places an enormous burden on the energy system. It is, most estimates say, that by 2050, we're going to need twice the amount of energy than we did in the year 2000. Twice the amount of energy. And then there comes the problem, we need half the amount of CO2. Because if we're going to address this long-term sustainable energy challenge, we're going to have to find a way of creating twice the amount of energy and yet address the whole CO2 challenge. This is a complete conundrum. And for a company like ours, we need to do that in a way that is profitable. We have to meet the needs of our shareholders. Our shareholders invest in us because they believe they get a return. So, in Shell, we sincerely believe in being part of that long-term sustainable energy future, but we have to be able to deliver returns to our shareholders while we're doing it. So, it is a volatile period of transitions in the energy system, which is going to take that triumvirate of civil society, governments, and corporations if we're going to actually address this in a meaningful way. So as I said, it's challenging, it's complicated, it's not something that we are going to be able to address easily. There's some pictures on here, I can give you some examples. We're invested in Shell in wind energy, we're invested in biofuels, so we're trying to work that whole renewables area. But of course, the majority of our work is like Ormen Lange is a very large gas development. There's a very good chance if you use gas in your home here in the UK that one or two of the molecules will have come from Norway. So Ormen Lange is a development that we have in Norway that puts gas into the UK gas grid. Similarly, we're trying to worry about technology for the long term and climate change through this little power station up here called Peterhead in Scotland. We're doing the world's first carbon capture and storage facility on a gas power station there. We're collaborating with the UK government to extract CO2 from the flue gases of that power station and then inject them in a disused oil field offshore Scotland called Goldeneye. So this picture tries to say, well, look, there's a hell of a lot of moving parts, and we're trying to work on all of these moving parts at the same time as delivering value for our shareholders. I mentioned to you about those three stakeholders: governments, civil society, and corporations. And we all have to play our part. I get challenged a lot. Why aren't you doing more, Ed, about this subject? Why aren't you doing more on CO2? Why aren't you doing more on renewables? Governments play a very, very important role, and I want to give you two examples of the tragedy of policy, government policy going wrong. So here's the two examples. This one talks about Germany. So what happened in Germany was a confluence of two things. Very, very strong green lobby in Germany. And at the same time, following the Fukushima accident, they turned away from nuclear power. And then across Europe, you had these trends over here. So, and particularly in Germany, the CO2 price on the carbon trading system in Europe collapsed. Because the US had suddenly discovered shale gas, and we'll come back to that, US coal became very cheap, and they started exporting it. Germany's industrialization is such that their overall energy demand is declining. But the government put in a very, very substantial amount of subsidy around renewables, particularly around solar energy and particularly around wind energy. So what happened in Germany? So what happened in Germany was all of this solar energy and wind energy displaced gas. So the gas-fired power stations started shutting down because they didn't need them. They, frankly, they had enough solar energy and wind energy, and that was great. And on a sunny, windy day in Germany, electricity prices can turn negative because they produce so much electricity they can't physically use it all. Unfortunately, of course, on a dark, still night, they don't produce anything. And so you need some sort of, we don't have the technology around energy storage yet, so you need something to compensate for the intermittent effect of renewable energy. So what they did was they started buying more coal. And so they invested and actually bizarrely built coal-fired power stations to compensate for this intermittent effect. Net result was that while initially when they invested heavily in these windmills and solar panels, the CO2 went down. Because they went then for this renewables plus coal model, actually the net result was actually the opposite of what people had intended. I can't believe the German government intended that they would end up with the same or worse CO2 despite having spent all this subsidy on windmills and solar panels. So my key message here is not to make fun of the Germans, absolutely not. It's to say you have to be so extremely thoughtful that well-intended policy has unintended consequences and can lead you to unintended outcomes that actually end up being the opposite of what you first intended. Let me give you another example. Californian ethanol. The Californians are very keen on zero emissions, and so they decided that they wanted to have renewable energies extensively deployed in California. So they passed a law that said you had to have renewable fuels, and ethanol is a very good one. But they decided that ethanol made from corn, which is often what first generation ethanol is made out of, was competing with food, and so they wouldn't allow that as an acceptable fuel. So the nearest place where you get good renewable ethanol from is Brazil. So of course they chartered a ship and started importing ethanol from Brazil. Good. But the enterprising Californian farmers decided that growing corn and making ethanol was really good business, but they couldn't sell it in California. But actually, because California was importing so much ethanol from Brazil, Brazil itself was slightly short. So they put that same molecules of ethanol back on the same ship and sailed it back down to Brazil. Net result for the planet, not so good. You burnt a whole bunch of fuel oil in shipping molecules of ethanol that look remarkably similar to one another up and down between California and Brazil. Unintended consequences, once again, of government regulation. So I think it needs a very grown-up dialogue between governments, corporations and civil society to get the formula right if we are going to work towards a long-term sustainable energy future. Let me press on. I want to talk a little bit more about technology and perhaps a few examples here. I think in technology we have to do a few things. We have to become really, really efficient at the production of traditional hydrocarbons. We have to kind of minimize the amount of energy we expend in developing those hydrocarbons. We have to invest very heavily in when we process hydrocarbons that we do so at the minimum cost and minimum waste and maximum efficiency. And you know, in Shell we spend about $1 to $1.5 billion on R&D, on multiple different fronts of R&D, including getting the best out of our existing facilities. We spend it on innovating in new ways to develop fuels. So on the top left, as you look at it, you can see Ras Laffan, Qatar. It's a gas to liquids project. We spent 40 years developing the chemical engineering, the Fischer-Tropsch reaction, the catalysts that all go to taking gas molecules and producing diesel, very, very clean diesel out of it in Ras Laffan. We spend a lot of money, not only though on the existing activity that we've got, but we try and invest heavily on the renewable side. Amal steam flood in Oman, I've been to that plant. It's an enormous greenhouse with a black pipe inside it. So you concentrate using parabolic mirrors the sun's rays onto a black pipe. You raise steam, and you use that steam to enhance oil production in Oman. So instead of burning fuel to create steam for enhanced oil production, you use the sun's rays. And we're currently working on expanding that project very extensively in Oman. So it's trying to innovate not only on the existing facilities, but also on new facilities and innovations around what can we do to help save energy and reduce the CO2 footprint of our own operations. And an industry like ours still has the ability to surprise. If you look at this chart, this is the story of North American gas. So if you'd asked people 10 years ago, they would have said that the Americas was done in terms of a hydrocarbon production province. In fact, we, along with everybody else, started building import terminals to import liquefied natural gas into the Americas. They stand there today as monuments to the naivete of our planning department. So we physically built the infrastructure to bring in natural gas because we thought the US was going to run out of energy and we're going to have to import extensively. And of course, what actually happened is that the sort of dark blue on this chart, the shale gas, so a guy by the name of Mitchell from a town called the Woodlands, Texas, had a belief that by fracturing rocks you could liberate gas and all of a sudden a new industry is born. So this has been completely transformational. It's been transformational in a number of ways. It's sort of very, very materially lowered the cost of energy in the US, which has caused a bit of reindustrialization. So things that, industries that were dispatched from the US because they were uneconomic, now suddenly have become economic again. We're planning on building a brand new chemical facility in the US. Heaps of companies are working on using that relatively cheap energy to do energy intensive things because they have now one of the cheapest energy prices on the planet. It had the unintended consequence of exporting coal to Germany, as I mentioned earlier, but also it had the consequence of many governments around the world now are thinking about, actually, could I repeat this in my own backyard? So if you read the papers here, there's, apparently shale gas reserves and shale deposit reserves here in the UK, but also in Poland and in China and in Ukraine. And so this is a potentially transformational technology for many countries around the world. I think today it's only the US that has truly cracked the formula of how to do it for a number of reasons that we can go into in a moment. But this has been, such a surprise for an industry that's been around 100 years. We thought we knew it all, and actually we didn't. The US is quite a special place, though, in this regard, for the following reasons. One, mineral rights ownership. So when you live in the US, if you own a piece of ground, you own the land that you stand on and everything beneath you. Whereas in this country, you own the land that you stand on, and anything beneath the surface is owned by the Crown. So the consequence of that is, when we're in the US, we have a shale business in the US. When we're in the US, we have people dragging us, please come onto my land and please drill in my land, because they will get the benefit of the mineral rights beneath their feet. Of course, in this country, as you've seen, we don't have a business here, but as you've seen with people who are trying to drill here, we have people saying, please go away from my land and never come near me with your drilling and fracking, because the economic incentive is certainly not in place for people to benefit from shale gas in this country. And the US is unusual that the mineral rights accrue, because it's, I think, almost all of the countries. We're present in about 5 countries in shale gas, and we don't yet see how the formula is going to get cracked in other countries, certainly not in a short time span. So if I was to perhaps summarize up where I've got to in this particular story, the energy challenge is enormous. It's probably one of the most pressing and challenges facing mankind, of how we get sufficient energy to meet the planet's needs, so literally and metaphorically keep the lights on, but at the same time address climate change. It's going to take an enormous effort between governments, companies and civil society, and also it's going to take an enormous amount of innovation in a number of different ways. It's going to take technology innovation, so I think we are going to need smarter widgets, more efficient widgets, more efficient systems of how we will generate, how we will transmit, and how we will consume energy. I think we're going to have to work on all of those elements of the value chain. But equally, as I was saying to Anand earlier, I think we're going to have to innovate on business models. I think this sort of model of a single large company developing energy and pushing it out on an unsuspecting world, which then sort of gives you a check for what they want, is not going to work in a world which is going to be multipolar. I mentioned my dad is 86, and he's about to become part of the electricity generating system of this country. He's going to have solar panels put on his roof, so that on a sunny day he's going to be selling electricity. Well, actually, but you know what I mean. He's going to be selling electricity into the grid. How are we going to optimize an electricity system that has thousands of producers, thousands of consumers, millions of consumers, and a very limited ability to store energy in terms of electricity? The battery technology is not there yet. So optimizing that system is going to be very different from this sort of single push model that we've got in the current hydrocarbon system. So it's going to take that innovation in business models as well as in technology. And for you, I mean, as I look out into the audience here, I mean, I can see many of you are about to embark on careers. My plea and my encouragement is, if you want something that's exciting and exhilarating and really makes a difference, wherever you stand on the climate change debate, whether you're I met many senators in the US who say, well, this is all made up lefty stuff that doesn't really exist, if you're on that side of it. Or equally, if you're on the, we should shut down entire world gas and oil production tomorrow. Whichever side of that spectrum you're on, the way to change it won't be from without. I think from the ability to change it will be from within. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is I think with enough right-minded people, actually we really can make a difference. We actually can make the transition to a long-term sustainable energy system. And it is the next 20 to 30 years that will decide if we do that successfully or if we really struggle with it. It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. And I'd love at least some of you to be part of that with me. I think it's, I'd encourage you to look at it as a possibility. So, how do we do it sustainably? I touched on the innovation piece on our own operations, and also and also looking at future sort of low carbon means of energy. I've got a whole heap of stuff here which is around our gas business. Gorgon is, I think the last time I looked at it, it was a $70 billion investment in Australia to produce liquefied natural gas. Just an enormous enterprise. Prelude is the largest thing that's ever been built by man that floats. You're not allowed to call it a ship because it's not powered, but it's basically like a ship without an engine. And you sail it above a gas field, and it's got a liquefied natural gas plant contained on the ship. So you moor it above the gas field, you connect it to the gas field, it liquefies the gas, it gets offtake to markets, and then when that gas field is depleted, you sail it off to another gas field. And it unlocks energy that is too far from shore to be piped ashore. Traditionally, for liquefied natural gas, you pipe it ashore, liquefy it onshore, and then sell it around the world. This one is a bit of an innovation that we're building right at the moment. It's in Korea, probably going to sail off in the next year or so. And Changbai, I'll just talk about Changbai as well. We've worked extensively with the government of China to look at exploiting their shale gas reserves in China. Changbai is a shale gas field in China that we've worked to develop for the Chinese government, and work collaboratively with CNPC, the Chinese state oil company. So Hazira is an LNG import facility in India. But it's not only good enough to have sort of projects like that. We have to keep pushing the boundaries. So I've got a couple of examples here of sort of the kind of stuff that I'm involved in day to day. What do I do? So I mentioned Mozambique earlier. So this is me signing an MOU in Mozambique for developing a gas to liquids plant in Mozambique. Nelson Okone, who's there with me, is the chief executive of their state oil company. So we're doing a joint venture in Mozambique to try and develop some of their gas resources. Gabra Nubier is a gas development in Nigeria. So we're trying to work. Nigeria is a very tough place to work. I'd be surprised if you didn't have some questions for me on Nigeria at some point. But we're working very hard with the Nigerian state oil company to try and develop the gas resources, because Nigeria, believe it or not, being one of the energy richest places on the planet, is extremely poor in electricity. So we're trying to help develop gas resources there to power the Nigerian market. And finally, perhaps I'll just touch on Gabon. So we're working with the Gabonese government to try and develop some offshore resources there. So they have very deep water resources in Gabon. We made a discovery last year, the leopard discovery, and we hope to sort of continue and prove out those reserves in the coming couple of years or so. So what's very different, I've spent 25 years in the downstream organization and then moved to the upstream. And the difference in the upstream is the upstream business is dying every day. What do I mean by that? In the downstream, when you build an oil refinery, you assume it's, first approximation, you assume it's there forever. Because you'll just put more crude through it and refine products. And when you build an upstream facility, so let's, Gabon, you know that it has a life. It may have a life of 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40, but you know it has a life. So you build it with a life expectancy. Today, Shell has 3.2 million barrels less crude than it did yesterday. And tomorrow, we'll have another 3.2 million barrels less crude than we did the day before. So if you're not investing and developing and doing business development and finding new resources, your company is literally dying in front of your very eyes, which gives an interesting dynamic to the place where you work. I think with that, looking at the clock, we've got 20 minutes left. Why don't we go to Q&A?